Nobody goes to that wing anymore, the housekeeper warned her. She picked up the candle and walked there anyway. There is a kind of cruelty that never raises its voice. It doesn't have to. It works in quieter ways. In the way a powerful man's name gets spoken in a room, not with respect, not with warmth, but with that particular drop in tone that people use when they are talking about something that used to matter. Such a shame, they say. He was remarkable once. Before. Caspian Vale, Duke of Ashenvale, had been hearing that word for 7 years. Before the war. Before the injury. Before he came home from a battlefield that his own command had sent him into knowing, it was not secured. Before he stopped being the kind of man this world had use for. He was 33 years old. He had not left the east wing of his own manor in 6 months. And on the morning Isadora Voss arrived in a black carriage with 2 trunks and no illusions, she had been told almost nothing about what she was walking into. Almost. Stay with me. Because what happened between the woman who walked toward a closed door and the man who had stopped opening them, that is not the story you think it is. If you have ever watched someone be written off by people who never bothered to look closely enough, this channel was built for you. Subscribe. Hit the bell. We tell stories here that stay with you after they end. Now let's go back to where this one really begins. His name was spoken before anyone saw him. That was always the way with Caspian Vale. Not because he was magnetic. Not because he commanded attention the way powerful men sometimes do, with volume, with performance, with the deliberate theater of importance. His name was spoken first because people needed to prepare themselves. Lord Aldrich Vale's youngest son. The War Duke. The one who came back wrong. It was Lady Maren Ashcroft who said it first, at the Pemberton winter gathering, loudly enough that the nearest 2 tables heard clearly. She was not a cruel woman by nature, she was simply the kind of woman who had never developed the habit of lowering her voice before speaking about people who were not present to defend themselves. Of course Aldrich is trying to arrange a marriage, she said, setting down her crystal glass with the particular decisiveness of someone making a pronouncement. But who would agree to it? The man barely leaves his rooms. I'm told the East Wing hasn't had a fire lit in the main hearth in 3 months. 3 months. In winter. The woman beside her, a younger woman, dark-eyed and quiet, whose name nobody at that table had yet learned, said nothing. She listened. I don't say it unkindly, Lady Maren continued, in the way that people preface the unkind things they are absolutely about to say. But a marriage requires a husband who is present. Who can manage an estate? Who can be seen in public without it becoming a conversation? Whatever he was before the war, and I did hear he was quite something before, that man is simply not there anymore. What remains is... She paused. Searched for the word. Difficult, she settled on. What remains is difficult. The younger woman at the edge of the table lifted her teacup. Her name was Isadora Voss. She was 24 hours away from becoming Caspian Vale's wife. And she had just learned more about what she was walking into than her own father had thought to tell her. She set the teacup down without sound. She did not correct Lady Maren. She did not perform shock or distress. She simply reached a quiet, private decision, the kind that does not announce itself, that does not require an audience, that simply settles into a person like a stone finding the floor of still water. She was going to look for herself. Not at the version of him that drawing rooms had assembled from rumor and pity and the particular comfort people take in deciding that a difficult situation is permanent. At him. Caspian Vale had not always been the man in the East Wing. There had been a before. A real one. At 22 he had been the kind of young man that a room noticed without understanding why, not because of the title, which he wore with the specific discomfort of someone who knows they didn't earn it, but because of the way he paid attention. He listened to people. Not politely. Actually. The kind of listening that makes the person talking feel like what they are saying matters, which is a rarer quality in powerful men than it should be. He read too much, his father said, as though there was a correct amount of reading for a duke's son and Caspian had exceeded it by an embarrassing margin. He argued positions he had actually considered rather than positions that were convenient. He asked questions in rooms where questions were not encouraged. His father, Lord Aldrich Vale, was a man who had built his considerable influence on the architecture of managed appearances. He knew how to enter a room, how to hold an alliance, how to communicate without saying anything that could be used against him. He did not know what to do with a son who seemed constitutionally incapable of pretending. At 24, Lord Aldrich solved this problem the way the Empire had always solved the problem of inconvenient young men. He sent him north. The Imperial Northern Regiment. The Calder border conflict. A war that had been running for 11 years and had developed, in that time, the particular institutional momentum of something that nobody in power actually wanted to end because ending it would require accounting for what it had cost. Caspian went. Because at 24, you still believe that showing up is the same as mattering. He fought for 2 years. He watched boys die for ground that would be surrendered before the season changed. He wrote letters that received no answers. He made friendships that lasted 1 winter. He began to understand, slowly and then suddenly and then with a finality that settled into him like a second skeleton, that the men directing this war from warm offices in the capital had made a calculation, that the men dying in the northern mud were a cost, not a catastrophe. That the distance between an acceptable loss and an actual human being was entirely a matter of how far away you were standing. He kept going anyway. Because that is what you do when you are 25 and the alternative is admitting that the thing you believed in was not worth believing in. Then came the Calder Ridge. The regiment was ordered forward. Caspian led his unit up a hillside that command had certified as secured. 37 men. He knew their names. He had learned all of them, not because protocol required it but because he was the kind of officer who believed that a man who does not know the names of the people he is leading is not actually leading them. The hillside was not secured. It had never been secured. The intelligence was not wrong by accident. There had been a meeting. There had been a decision, made by 2 senior officers in a warm room far from the Calder Ridge, that the assault timeline required forward movement and that the risk to one unit was an acceptable cost to the broader campaign. They walked into the ambush on a Thursday morning in February. Caspian kept his unit moving for 4 minutes after the first volley. Kept calling orders. Kept trying to pull the line into any formation that might get more of them out. Then 3 arrows found him. 1 in the shoulder. 1 in the side. 1 that struck near the base of his spine with the kind of damage that announces itself not as pain but as wrongness, a deep structural wrongness that told him, even through the shock of it, that something had changed permanently. He went down. He heard the retreat call. He heard boots moving away. And then nothing. He survived because a woman named Sarah found him 2 days later. She was a farmer's widow. She had lost her own son to the same campaign 4 months prior. She brought Caspian inside and spent 3 weeks keeping him alive with fire and knowledge and a ferocious refusal to accept that survival was not an option. He survived. But not whole. Not the way before the war whole means. His left leg moved differently now. On flat ground, controlled terrain, he could manage it. On difficult ground, in cold weather, on bad days when the old wound spoke loudly, he needed the cane. And on the worst days, he needed more than that. He came home to Ashenvale Manor not with ceremony but in the dark. No announcement. No gathering of staff on the steps. Lord Aldrich had arranged it that way. The official story was released through careful social channels. The Duke had returned from service with a private health matter. Sensitive. Ongoing. Not to be discussed at public functions. What was not released, the truth about the Calder Ridge. The intelligence. The decision. The names. Because those names were still in the capital. Still on councils. Still at dinners with Lord Aldrich. And Lord Aldrich had spent 40 years learning that the truth is only useful when it costs less than the lie. So Caspian was installed in the East Wing. He was 33 years old. He had not attended a social function in 6 years. He had declined 5 arranged introductions to prospective brides, not with drama, not with explanation, simply with a silence so complete that Lord Aldrich's intermediaries eventually stopped delivering the messages. He spent his days with his maps. With his books. With the particular companionship of windows that face away from courtyards where life continues without you. And he had, not in a single moment, not with a clear date he could point to, but gradually, over years, the way water shapes stone, begun to believe what the silence was telling him. That what remained of him was the lesser thing. That the man he had been before the ridge was the real one. That this, the wing, the cane, the careful management of how much he let the world see, was something to be endured, not inhabited. He was wrong. He just needed someone who refused to agree with him. Stop here for 1 second. Because I need you to understand something before we go further. What Isadora is about to do, walking toward a closed door in a dark corridor at 9 o'clock in the evening, with no script and no plan and no guarantee that anyone will open it, most people never do that. Most people hear what Lady Marin said at that table and adjust their expectations downward. Manage their disappointment in advance. Decide that the situation is what it is. Isadora did not do that. And I want to know, have you ever walked toward something that the entire world around you had already decided was not worth walking toward? Tell me in the comments. Because the next part of this story, the door, the letters, the thing Lord Aldrich had been hiding for 7 years, that is where this becomes something else entirely. Keep watching. Isadora Voss arrived at Ashenvale Manor on a Tuesday. 2 trunks. No maid. A composure that the household staff would later describe, to one another, in quiet hallways, as the most deliberate thing they had ever watched a person carry into a difficult room. She had prepared herself on the carriage ride north. Not for what she had been told, which was almost nothing. For what she had observed. For Lady Marin's voice dropping at a dinner table. For her father's specific pause before answering the question she had asked him directly. For the particular quality of silence that surrounds a topic that people have collectively decided not to look at too closely. She had been 11 years old when her mother died. Her father had remarried within 14 months. The household had reorganized around the new arrangement with an efficiency that Isadora had found, even at 11, more frightening than the grief itself. She had learned early that the people around her were capable of performing stability with complete conviction while something real and important was dissolving underneath it. She had spent 17 years since then learning to see beneath the performance. She arrived at Ashenvale. She was shown to the South Corridor rooms. She was told the wedding would take place in 4 days. She was told the Duke would not be receiving visitors in the days prior. She asked which wing his rooms were in. The housekeeper, a woman named Greth, 60 or so, with the careful exhausted eyes of someone who had been watching this household operate for 30 years and had long since run out of the ability to pretend it was functioning correctly, paused before answering. 1 beat too long. That information isn't necessary at this time, she said. Isadora thanked her. She spent the next full day learning the manor the way she had always learned unfamiliar territory, through attention. Which servants moved where? Which hallways went quiet at which hours? Which doors had the specific quality of deliberate avoidance built into the way the household moved around them? The East Wing. On the second evening she took a candle. She walked there. She had not prepared what to say. She had decided that walking to that door with a prepared speech was exactly the wrong thing. That if there was a person behind it, a real one, the actual one, not the version the household managed around, then a performance was the last thing that would reach him. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again. A voice. Low. The specific roughness of a voice that has not been used for real conversation in a long time, the way a door sounds when the hinges have not moved in months. Whatever you're bringing, leave it outside. She said, I'm not bringing anything. Silence. Who are you? Not a question. The sound of someone who had stopped expecting answers to be worth having. Isadora Voss. I believe we are getting married in 3 days. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear the candle flame move in the cold air of the corridor. Then, go away. She stood there. Not defiantly. Not performing courage for an invisible audience. She simply stood there the specific amount of time it takes to mean something, and then she said, quietly, to the wood of the door. I have been told very little about you. I suspect the same is true in reverse. I am not asking to come in. I only thought that you should know I am a real person and not an arrangement. And I thought you should hear my voice before you decided whether or not you wanted to know me. She left. She did not sleep easily that night. She did not regret going. The ceremony had 14 guests. Lord Aldrich had called it intimate. It was small because a larger wedding required the Duke to perform in public for an extended period, and Lord Aldrich had learned not to create situations he could not control. Caspian arrived 4 minutes after the appointed time. He wore charcoal gray. Dark cane, silver handle, chosen to be as unremarkable as possible, the object of a man who has learned to wish his limitations invisible. His left leg moved with the controlled deliberateness of someone who has spent years managing pain in full view of other people and has become expert at offering no opening for comment. He did not look at her. He looked at a fixed point above the officiant's shoulder. His jaw was set.
I want to stop here for just 1 second. Because what Isadora just did, most people never do that. Most people find information like that and think about themselves first. What it means for them. How they can use it. How it protects them. She thought about him. And I need to ask you something before we go further. Have you ever been the person who told someone a hard truth, not because it helped you but simply because they deserve to know it? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Keep watching. We are not done yet.
His grip on the cane shifted, not from weakness but from the conscious effort of a man using every available resource simply to be present. Isadora looked at him directly. She had looked at her brother the same way after his riding accident at 15, the way you look at someone when you are saying, without words and without permission asked, I see you. Not the version of you that has been constructed from other people's discomfort. You. She did not look at the cane. She looked at his face. At the set of his jaw. At the faint lines around his eyes that had nothing to do with age. At the specific quality of his stillness, not the stillness of a man at peace but the stillness of a man who has built a wall and is standing behind it with both hands pressed flat against the stone. She recognized what she was looking at. Not damage. A person who had been told, in 100 indirect and accumulated ways, that the space they occupied was conditional. That their presence required justification. That they were, in some essential, unspoken, never directly stated way, a problem being politely managed rather than a man being known. The ceremony continued. At the moment of formal acknowledgement, the old Ashenvale rite where the bride speaks her acceptance aloud, Isadora did not say the scripted words. She turned to him. She said his name. Just that. Just his name. Caspian. Not your grace. Not my lord. Not the title that the world used to maintain its comfortable distance from the actual person. His name. Said the way you say something when you mean it to land. Something changed in his face. Small. Barely visible. The specific release of a single line of tension, the way a room changes when one window is opened and a thin line of different air comes in. He did not smile. But he looked at her. Fully. Without the fixed point distance. Without the wall. He looked at her like a man remembering that looking at people was something he used to do. Nobody tells you what marriage actually is in the hours that aren't ceremonial. It is learning the sound of another person's footsteps in a hallway until you can tell by the pace whether they slept. It is the radius of proximity expanding, how close you stand when you are both looking at the same thing, widening by inches over weeks without either of you marking the moment it changed. Caspian and Isadora did not begin as a love story. They began as two people navigating shared space with the specific care of individuals who have both been let down by trust and have privately decided that wanting less is safer than wanting more. She did not push. She did not treat him like a project. She did not bring the particular exhausting energy of a person who has decided that someone else's healing is their purpose. She treated him like a person. Which sounds simple. It was not simple. It was the hardest thing anyone had done for him in 7 years. One evening she asked about the maps, the old annotated cartography she had noticed in the hallway near his wing. Whether he had made the margin notes himself. He said yes. He had cross-referenced the official imperial maps against what he had actually observed in the northern provinces during his deployment. The official versions contained significant errors. Terrain misrepresented. Village positions wrong. River routes that existed on paper and nowhere else. She asked what the practical consequences of those errors would have been. He told her. He talked for 11 minutes. She counted, later, not because the number mattered but because she wanted to remember accurately the first time she had seen him speak at length, the way he leaned slightly forward, the way his hands moved when he was describing ground he had actually stood on, the way the fixed-point guardedness in his eyes gave way, briefly, to something that looked like the person he had been before 7 years of East Wing silence had worked on him. After that, dinner was different. Not dramatically. The way things change when they are actually changing, quietly, in increments too small to announce, until one day the room feels different and you cannot identify the specific moment it shifted. Lord Aldrich watched from his end of the long table with an expression Isadora filed carefully away. Not displeasure. Something more complicated. The look of a man watching a situation develop outside the parameters he had designed it for. She noted it. She said nothing. 3 weeks into the marriage, Isadora found the letters. She was in the estate study, working through the household accounts, a task that had been managed vaguely in her absence and required real attention. Greth moved through the room in the quiet efficient way she always did. At some point, Greth left. A drawer in the lower cabinet was not fully closed. Not carelessly. Isadora had watched this housekeeper for 3 weeks. Greth was not a careless woman. Every movement she made in this household was precise, considered, aware of exactly who was watching and what they would see. The drawer was open on purpose. Isadora sat with that knowledge for 1 full minute. Then she crossed the room and opened it. Military correspondence. Imperial letterhead. Dated 7 years ago. She read them standing. The language was official, the careful dense prose of military bureaucracy that places its most significant content in passive constructions and subordinate clauses, designed to say important things in ways that are difficult to directly quote or attribute. But Isadora had spent years reading her father's trade correspondence. She knew how to find the real weight inside the formal container. The Calder Ridge assault had not been a tactical error. The intelligence had been accurate. The hillside had been known to be unsecured. There had been an internal dispute between 2 senior officers, one who argued for withdrawal and one who argued for proceeding. The officer who argued for proceeding had prevailed. His name was in the letters. His name was also on the Imperial Military Council. He had held that position for 6 years. He was one of Lord Aldrich Vale's oldest and most protected political relationships. The ambush that had taken Caspian's mobility. His name. His public existence. His belief in his own worth. The 7 years of East Wing silence and accumulated invisible devastation. Not an accident. A decision. Made by men with names. Accepted by a father who had known from the beginning and had chosen, every single day for 7 years, to protect the men responsible rather than the son they had broken. Isadora stood in the study for a long time. She was not a dramatic person. She did not move when she was processing something real. She went still, the particular stillness of deep water, where everything is happening below the surface and the surface shows nothing. Then she picked up the letters. And she went to the east wing. Scene 9, the moment he came undone. He opened the door when she knocked. He had started doing that, opening it when it was her, sometime in the second week. She had never remarked on it. She understood that remarking on it would have been the wrong thing. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. This man who had learned to carry pain quietly. Who moved through his own home with the careful awareness of someone who had internalized, across years of accumulated evidence, the message that his presence was a complication to be managed rather than a life to be lived. She felt something she had not expected. Not pity. Pity looks down. What she felt was level. Horizontal. The specific fury of someone who has understood exactly what was taken and exactly who took it and is standing in front of the person who never got to know. She said, "I need to show you something. I found it by accident. I spent one full day deciding whether to give it to you. And I decided that you have been kept in the dark about your own life for long enough." She gave him the letters. He read them standing. He had to sit down after the third page. She sat in the chair across from him and she stayed. She did not speak. She did not try to shape or manage the experience for him. She let him have it completely, the full unmediated weight of finding out that the worst thing that had ever happened to him had not been random. That there were names. That one of those names had sat across from him at dinner for his entire life and had looked him in the eyes and had said nothing. She watched him read. She watched the moment he reached his father's correspondence. The way his hands went still. The way his breathing changed. The way something in his face, some final internal structure that had been holding everything else upright, came quietly apart. When he finally looked up, his face was the kind of still that only exists after everything maintaining the stillness has already broken. He said, he knew. She said, yes. From the beginning. From shortly after. The letters suggest yes. Silence. Then, is this why he arranged the marriage? Because a married duke is easier to manage? Because a man with something to lose is easier to keep quiet? She had asked herself the same question in the study. She said, maybe part of it. But I think there is also a version of him that simply needed the title to continue and had spent so long treating you as a problem to manage that he could no longer see you as a person separately from the problem. That is not better. No. It isn't. He looked at her. The full direct searching look she had come to recognize, the way Caspian Vale looked at something when he was deciding whether it was real or whether he was about to be disappointed by it again. He said, "Why are you doing this? You could have used these yourself. Protection. Leverage. There are women who would have." She said, "I know. So why?" She was quiet. Then she said, "Because the night before the wedding I stood outside a door and spoke to a man who hadn't been spoken to honestly in years and I could hear it. In 2 sentences. And because on the morning of the ceremony I watched you hold yourself together in front of 14 people and I understood exactly what that cost you. And because nobody should find out what is in those letters alone." She paused. "And because your name is Caspian. Not the Duke of Ashenvale. Not the injured heir. Not the difficulty in the East Wing. Caspian. And I decided on the first day that I was going to keep seeing you that way regardless of what anyone else in this house was doing." The silence after that was different from every silence before it. It had something in it. Not resolution. Nothing was resolved. But recognition. The specific weight of 2 people who have, without planning it, arrived at the same place of actual honesty, and who both know, simultaneously, that this is rarer than it should be and more valuable than anything else currently in the room. Caspian did not confront his father dramatically. He wrote letters. To the Imperial Military Council. To a legal advocate in the capital who had spent 11 years building cases against military negligence and had been waiting for someone with standing to provide documentation. To 2 journalists he had known before the war, men who were still working, still interested in the space between official record and actual truth. He documented everything. Precisely. Completely. With dates and names and the specific chain of decisions that led from a warm office in the capital to a hillside in the Calder that 37 men walked up and fewer walked down. Isadora sat beside him for 3 days and helped him organize it. She did not tell him how to feel. She did not manage the experience for him. She brought the same focused precision she had spent years applying to her father's trade ledgers, finding the load-bearing facts inside a complicated structure, understanding which details presented in which sequence made a case that could not be dismissed. She was very good at this. Lord Aldrich found out 3 days before the first letter reached the capital. He came to the East Wing himself. Something he had not done in years. He stood in the doorway and he looked at his son and he said the thing that men in his position always say when all other options have been exhausted. I did what I had to do to protect this family. Caspian looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You left me on that hillside twice. Once when I was actually there. And once every day for 7 years when you chose to protect the men responsible rather than tell the truth about what they did. I am not going to protect you from the consequences of that." Lord Aldrich looked at Isadora. She met his gaze without moving. He left. The inquiry took 4 months. The officer whose decision had sent Caspian's unit into the Calder Ridge ambush was removed from his position. There were formal censures. Legal proceedings. The slow institutional grinding of accountability that never moves as fast as the damage did but eventually, under sufficient pressure, moves. Lord Aldrich retained most of his titles. Power protects power. That is not a surprise and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. But 2 of his most significant alliances dissolved quietly in the year that followed. Men who had built their trust in him on the assumption that he could manage his own house found that assumption no longer reliable. He aged visibly. He and Caspian did not reconcile. Some things are not reparable. Knowing that is not failure. It is accuracy. Caspian did not recover his physical mobility. The injury was 7 years old and permanent. He would always walk with the cane. He would always have bad days. The weather would always speak to the old wound in the language of cold and damp and the specific deep ache of damage that has become structural. But something else changed. He came out of the East Wing. Not all at once. Gradually, the way a person re-enters the world when something has reminded them that they are worth the space they occupy. One public function. Then another. He was quieter than courts preferred, more direct than social performance required, less charming in the performed way that power admires in men. But he was present. And something about the combination, the cane, the deliberate walk, the absolute refusal to apologize for either, produced in the people who encountered him a reaction they had not expected. Not pity. Attention. The specific quality of attention that a room gives to someone who has survived something significant and has declined, clearly and without announcement, to be diminished by it. The court, which had spent 7 years writing Caspian Vale off, found that it did not know what to do with a Caspian Vale who had stopped requiring its assessment. Isadora, for her part, found herself in possession of something she had not anticipated and had not thought to want. Not the title. Not the estate. Not the social position the marriage had technically granted her. A person. An actual one. The kind you can be completely honest with, which is rarer than it sounds, and which is, if you have spent enough time among people who prefer performance to truth, the most valuable thing there is. She had not married for love. She had married practically, into a complicated situation with no clear map and very little honest information. But love, the real kind, not the feeling but the choice, the daily sustained decision to keep seeing someone clearly and keep being honest with them even when honesty is harder than performance, had built itself in the space their honesty made. He asked her once, late in the first year, what she had actually thought when she first saw him at the wedding. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought you were someone who had been told for so long and in so many ways that what remained of him was not worth very much, that you had started, very quietly, to believe it. And I thought that was the greatest waste I had seen in a long time." He was still. Then, and now? She looked at him. She said, "Now I think you always knew exactly who you were. You just needed someone to stay in the room long enough for you to remember it out loud." He took her hand. Quietly. "The way you reach for something when you are no longer afraid it will disappear." Outside, the autumn light moved across the floor of the East Wing, the wing he no longer lived in alone, the wing that no longer felt like exile, that had simply become, without ceremony, without announcement, the place where his actual life happened now. He had not smiled easily, in 7 years. He smiled. "Before you go. Because I need you to hear this. Caspian Vale was not broken. He was in pain. Those are not the same thing, even though every person in his life spent 7 years treating them as though they were. The injury did not diminish him. The silence did. The years of being managed and minimized and kept out of sight because the truth of what happened to him was inconvenient to the men responsible, that is what almost finished him. Not the arrows. And what reversed it was not a miracle. It was not a grand gesture. Not a speech. Not a scene designed for an audience. It was a woman who heard something cruel said about a man she had not yet met, at a dinner table, casually, by a woman who did not lower her voice, and who made a private decision, without announcement, to look for herself. Who walked toward a closed door with no script. Who sat in a chair across from a man reading something devastating and did not leave. Who looked at him and saw Caspian, not the Duke, not the difficulty, not the before and after, just Caspian. That is the thing that actually changes people. Not being rescued. Being seen. If this story moved something in you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already. And tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest. The door? The wedding? The letters? The moment he said, "You left me on that hillside twice"? I read every single comment. And I will see you in the next story. Because there is always another one worth telling.
I need you to hear this before you go. Caspian Vale was not broken. He was in pain. And those are not the same thing, even though the people around him spent 7 years treating them as if they were. The injury did not diminish him. The silence did. The years of being managed and minimized and kept out of sight, that is what almost finished him. Not the arrows. That is the kind of thing that actually changes a person. Not being rescued, being seen. If the story reached something in you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already. And leave me a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one. See you in the next story.